We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara and Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 19a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing the machlokas in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva seem to be saying that when it comes to the lapse of awareness in terms of liability by Yedias HaTumah, the lapse of awareness has to specifically be that the person forgot that he was Tameh, not a lapse of awareness in terms of Kodesh or Mikdash. And so the Gemara asked, well, what exactly is the difference between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva? And Chizkiah answered on the previous Amud that the difference is Rabbi Eliezer requires that when there's that initial Yedias HaTumah, that the person knows that he became Tameh, he has to know exactly how he became Tameh, either through Sheretz or Nevela, and that's learned from the Pasuk. The Pasuk mentions specifically Sheretz. It doesn't need to mention that, so that shows that the person again needs to know exactly how he has become Tameh. And so the Gemara asks, what does Rabbi Akiva do with that pasuk? And the Gemara here says, Rabbi Akiva says, since the boy lemichtav behema v'chaya, since it needs to write both behema and chaya in the pasuk, l'chid Rebbe, and that's for the teaching of Rebbe in the first parak. Rashi says, l'chid Rebbe b'parakama ekrani chaya behema lamanemra. Again, why does it have to say behema? We already would know it from chaya. And the Gemara there goes on to say that it's to teach us we're talking about a situation of Tumas Kodesh specifically. So in any case, because it needs to write that for the teaching of Rebbe, so ksiv nami sheretz, or Rabbi Akiva says that's why it also writes sheretz. Kedetana devei Rabbi Shmuel, it's like it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, called parsha shenemra v'nishnis. Anytime you have a parsha that was said once and then repeated, lo nishnis ela b'shvil davar shenes chadish. But the reason it's repeated is because there must be something new over there, and again that's what's happening over here as well. And the Gemara continues for Rabbi Eliezer, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, hai ba my avidle, what does he do with the word ba? This is a reference to the machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua in the previous summer. Rabbi Yoshua used the word ba to say that by a carbon chatas, in order to be liable to bring that carbon chatas, the person needs to know what sin he committed, and Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with that. And so what does he do with the word ba? And the Gemara says to that, prat lemisasek, he uses that word ba to exclude a situation of misasek. Rashi says, prat lemisasek bedavar heter ubali yado isser. That would mean to say, let's say a person is doing something that is totally mutter, and then he ends up doing a different action, an action that he wasn't thinking of doing, and that action happens to be something that's usser. Again, he had no intention to do this particular action at all. For example, let's say a person has intention to cut something which is detached from the ground, and then instead he cuts something else which is attached to the ground. Or let's say, for example, he has intention to be with his wife, and his sister is with him in the bed. And so then his wife, she leaves, and he ends up having relations with his sister. Now Rashi points out, what would be a situation where we say you're liable? Because again, you're liable to a carbon in a situation of a shogeg, of a mistake. So how is that different from what Rashi just said? So that's different in the following way. Let's say he has intention to cut this exact thing which he did cut, and he thought that that item was detached from the ground, but it turned out to be attached. That's different than the case above. In the case above, he had intention to cut a different item which was detached, and instead he cut something which was attached to the ground. Or let's say, for example, he thought today was a weekday, but it wasn't. Or he thought this particular malacha was mutter, but it's not. But in all these cases, nevertheless, he had intention to do exactly what he did. For example, also you can have a case, let's say he had relations with his sister, but he knew exactly which person he was having relations with. He just thought that this happened to be his wife. It turned out it was really his sister, but it's not like it was a different person that he was having intention for. So again, that would be a situation of liability for a carbon. And the Gemara continues with another approach to the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, and that is that it's not really a machlokas at all. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, Mashmos Dorshan Ika Benayu. They're just learning the same thing, but from different psukim. They're not actually arguing in any practical matter. Again, they both say that you have to have a lapse of awareness in terms of the Tumah, not a lapse of awareness in terms of Kodesh and Mikdash. V'chein Amar Rav Sheshes, and Rav Sheshes says the same thing. Mashmos Dorshan Ika Benayu. Again, it's just a question of how you darshan the psukim, how you understand the psukim. To Rav Sheshes machlef to Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Akiva, with Rabbi Akiva to Rabbi Eliezer, because Rav Sheshes we find that he sometimes even switched Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, because the point is he would switch them because there was no actual practical difference. Rashi explains the Rav Sheshes machlef k'shayashona mishnah seinu, when he would learn our mishnah, pa'amim machlef divrei zeh, sometimes he would switch around this one's words from that one's words, v'lo hayamak, but he wasn't careful about that, lefi she'ein beineim chiyav uptor, because there is no difference between them in terms of liability and in terms of exemption. And the Gemara continues, Boy minei Rava me Rav Nachman. Rava asked Rav Nachman the following question. Helim zeh v'zeh biyado ma. What if the lapse of awareness is in terms of both? Rashi explains, Helim zeh v'zeh tumah u'mikdash. Let's say he has a lapse of awareness in the tumah and in the mikdash. Mahu l'Rebbe Eliezer v'Rebbe Kiva de Patri al helim mikdash. So what would Rebbe Eliezer and Rebbe Kiva who say that the person is exempt when there's a lapse of awareness in terms of mikdash? Well, what if there's a lapse of awareness in terms of both? So Amar Lei, so he said to him, Hare helim tumah biyado v'chayiv. He said, well, it is a situation of a lapse of awareness from the tumah, and therefore he should be chayiv. But the Gemara questions this, Adrab, on the contrary. Hare helim mikdash biyado upater. Isn't there also a lapse of awareness in terms of mikdash, and that should be a reason for exemption? And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Ashi says, Chazinan, what we have to see. Imi tumah kaparish, if he's separating because of the fact that he finds out that it's tumah, so Hare helim tumah biyado. That shows that the tumah is the thing that he is taking seriously, so to speak, in his eyes, and therefore there's a lapse of awareness of tumah, v'chayiv, and therefore he'd be liable. But imi mikdash kaparish, but if he separates because he finds out this is the mikdash, hare helim mikdash biyado, so that's a lapse of awareness in terms of mikdash, upater, and he would be exempt. But the Gemara immediately questions this. Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi. Ravina says to Rav Ashi, klum parish mi mikdash ela mishum tumah. Why would the person separate from mikdash? It's only because it's tumah in the mikdash. And klum parish mi tumah ela mishum mikdash. And also, why is a person separating from tumah? Because of the fact that it's tumah in the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, you need both components for there to be a prohibition, for there to be an isser. So you can't really say that the person, when he finds out, he's separating because of this or that, because both of them are really important. And so the Gemara says, Ela lo shna, rather, there is no difference. And Rashi explains, Ela lo shna, there is no difference. Upater, and actually, again, he would be exempt in the situation where there's a lapse of awareness of both. And the Gemara continues, Tana Rabban, and the rabbis taught, Shnei Shevilin, let's say there are two roads, there are two paths, Echad Tameh ve'echad tar. We know that one of them is Tameh and one of them is tar, but we don't know which one is the one that is Tameh. V'halach barishon, and what happens is the person walks on the first path, V'lo nichnas, he doesn't yet enter the Beis HaMikdash. And then B'sheni, then he walks on the second path, V'nichnas, and he enters the Beis HaMikdash. So in such a situation, Chayiv, in such a situation, he actually would be liable to bring the carbon olav v'yored for Tumas Mikdash v'kadashav. Rashi explains, Echad Tameh meis cover bo v'efshar lahalach shelo yal. We know there's a dead body there, it's impossible not to become Tameh. Again, we don't know which one. V'halach barishon, he walks on the first one. Ve'enu yodeim b'tameh b'tar v'lo nichnas l'mikdash. He doesn't know whether he walked on the Tameh path or the tar path. And then he goes on b'sheni v'nichnas, and then again, he goes on the second path and he enters v'chazar v'halach b'sheni v'yadash halach b'shneim. The point here is that he does know that he walked on both of these paths, and so certainly he's Tameh. V'areu Tameh v'adai, and he's certainly Tameh. V'nichnas l'mikdash b'helam tumah, shenesalam imenu tumah. Then he has a lapse of awareness that he's Tameh, and he enters the mikdash. So chayiv carbon olav yored sheyesh kan betchila yediyah vadoi. So he's chayiv the carbon olav yored because he does have an initial awareness and then a lapse of awareness. So that would be a case again where he is going to be liable. And the Gemara continues, the Brisa continues, halach barishon. Now let's say he walks on the first path, v'nichnas, and he enters, and then he's a v'shana v'taval, and then he goes ahead and he goes through the purification process in case he was tamei. V'yachar gach halach b'sheni, and then he goes ahead and walks on the second path, v'nichnas, and he enters the Beis HaMikdash. So chayiv, so he's going to be chayiv in that situation. But Rabbi Shimon poter, but Rabbi Shimon says that in such a situation he's going to be exempt. And Rashi explains, halach barishon v'yada shu safek tamei. Now in this case, he just knows that there's a doubt whether he's tamei. V'nichnas l'mikdash b'helam tumah sheshachach chilucho b'shvilzu. Then he forgets that he walked on this path, so there's that lapse of awareness and he enters the mikdash. But in this case, it was all a safek. V'hiza v'shana, and then he goes ahead and he sprinkles himself in terms of going through the process of purification. He's a b'shlishi, v'shana b'shvi v'taval, means to say again, you're using the mechatos from the Parah Adumah, you're doing that on the third day and on the seventh day, and then you immerse. In other words, he goes through the purification process. V'chazar v'halach b'sheni v'yada shu safek tamei, and again now he goes to the second path, and again now he knows that he has a doubt whether he's tamei. V'nichnas l'mikdash b'helam tumah, and again he enters the mikdash with that lapse of awareness. So chayiv, so at the end of this whole thing, he is going to be chayiv, because omach must be a rishona, omach must be a shniya. One of these things was a situation of tumah. Demanavshach, o be a rishona, o be a shniya, but tumah, one of these, the first or the second, was betumah, and so therefore he has to bring the carbon according to the Tanna Kama. For Rabbi Shimon poter, Rabbi Shimon says exempt. The ein kan biachas mikulan yediyah vadois, because there was no certain yediyah in the beginning. In both times, it was a doubt. Betchila at the beginning, he didn't know for certain that he was tamei. Sha'av yediyah tchila shal shvil sheni, even the knowledge that he had on the second path, sveikohi, that's already a doubt. Sharei tar because at that point he's already purified himself from the first tama. Im harishon hu tamei, if the first one was in fact tamei. And that's why Rabbi Shimon says exempt. And the Brisa concludes, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda poter bekulon mishum Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, he says poter in all of them, meaning in both cases. Rashi says poter bekulon af b'rishon. Even in the first case, he says exempt ulakaman mefarish lo. The Gemara will explain that as we go on. The Gemara continues at the two dots bekulon in all of them. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda from Rabbi Shimon says poter, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yotes Amud Beis.